For centuries humanity stayed silent on the edge of the galaxy like a quiet shadow, never starting wars, never challenging anyone, never showing power, and most alien species believed humans were soft, harmless, and peaceful. A tiny species that preferred farming, research, and quiet living instead of conflict, and the Galactic Council even joked that humans were the gardeners of the stars because they never raised weapons, never argued, never demanded territory, and for 300 long years that silence continued. Earth kept its borders closed, sent no warships, built no armies, and whenever aliens passed near human space they saw calm planets, calm transmissions, calm people, and they assumed humans were weak. But deep inside that silence there was something else, something no one ever noticed. Pain, memory, and a promise that if humanity was ever attacked again, the galaxy would tremble. And one cold night that nightmare began when a tiny mining colony called Haven sent a desperate distress call across space, a terrified voice screaming about fire, explosions, children crying, alarms blaring, and then silence, total silence, and when the response teams arrived hours later they found nothing alive. The buildings burned to ash, the ground black, and in the center of the colony stood a single curved metal slab stabbed into the soil like a knife, with words carved so deep the metal bent and cracked. Humans kneel. And that message carried a poison that spread through every human heart because this was not an accident, not a disaster, not a mistake. It was a declaration, a threat, a command, and when the species responsible, the Varco's Dominion, broadcast their statement across star networks, they mocked humanity, laughing that humans were weak, fragile, soft-bodied creatures who should kneel before superior races, and the entire galaxy listened, amused, shaking their heads, saying humans would stay quiet like always, and the Galactic Council dismissed the massacre as a regional conflict, refusing to investigate, refusing to punish the killers, saying humans should move on, treating the death of thousands like dust in the wind. But the Council made a fatal mistake because they believed silence meant fear. They believed peace meant weakness. They believed stillness meant surrender. But they never understood what silence truly meant for humanity, and far beneath the surface of Earth, deeper than any alien scanner had ever reached, there was a place. Known only by another name, Vault Zero, a hidden command bunker buried under kilometers of rock and metal, sealed for centuries, forgotten by the galaxy, but not forgotten by humans, and inside that enormous underground chamber lay rows and rows of massive black ships, silent, cold, asleep, covered in dust, yet humming faintly with power, as though waiting, listening, and when the news of Haven 4's death reached Earth, alarms that had been quiet for 300 years suddenly came alive, red. Lights flashing, screens shaking, ancient codes waking up, doors unlocking, and a single voice echoed through the bunker's speakers, calm but filled with steel. Protocol Iron Dawn activated. And in that second the silent fleet began to awaken, engines rumbling like thunder, metal shifting, lights turning on one by one, revealing enormous warships unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Ships built in secret long before the Council ever formed, built during a forgotten war that humanity never spoke about, ships designed for one purpose, to end threats permanently, and as the engines roared to life, the ground trembled above, cities felt the vibration, oceans rippled, and every human felt something deep in their chest, a pulse, an ancient instinct, the awakening of anger that had been buried for generations. Because humans did not shout, they did not kneel, they did not beg, they remembered, they endured, and when pushed too far, they rose, and that night Earth's skies darkened. As massive hangar doors opened in hidden mountains, beneath frozen poles, under desert sands, and one by one colossal warships rose into the sky like black giants, silent but powerful, leaving no broadcasts, no warnings, just cold purpose. And in the command center of Vault Zero stood the Supreme Commander, an older man with silver hair and calm eyes, staring at the burning data on the screen showing the destroyed colony, the dead families, the message humans kneel, and he whispered only 3 words, never again, ever, and with a single gesture he activated the fleet's navigation grid, plotting a course into deep space toward the Varco's Dominion, the species that laughed at human pain, and he spoke to every ship, every soldier, every pilot, every human in uniform, his voice steady and quiet like a storm before lightning. For 3 centuries we stayed silent, we chose peace, we chose patience, but they murdered our own. They mocked our dead. They told us to kneel, and now we rise. And across Earth billions felt a shift, a cold fire, a unity they hadn't felt in centuries, as transmissions went silent and human space locked down, cutting off all communication with the galaxy, and aliens watching from distant systems grew confused, wondering why Earth suddenly went dark. But no one dared approach, because something about that silence felt different, heavy, dangerous. And rumors spread that humans were planning retaliation. But the Council scoffed, saying humans had no weapons, no armies, no fleets, but the Council never knew about the Silent Fleet, a project erased from history, hidden even from human allies, a fleet built in shadows after an ancient betrayal long forgotten, a fleet waiting for the day humanity's hand would be forced, and now that day had come, and as the warships formed a massive formation above Earth, engines glowing blue like burning suns, the stars reflected off their black armor, making them look like living shadows, unstoppable and cold, and the lead warship, an enormous dreadnought the size of a small moon, activated its command beacon, sending one silent message through space, a message not broadcast in words but in raw power, a pulse so strong alien scanners across the galaxy suddenly froze, alarms going off, worlds panicking, because the pulse revealed something terrifying. Human ships were shielded by unknown technology, impossible to scan, invisible to tracking, and no one understood how humans built such things. How? They hid it for centuries, and in council chambers alien leaders stared at their screens in horror as the reality sank in. Humanity had never been weak, they had been preparing, waiting, watching, and now they were angry, truly angry, and an angry human race was something the galaxy had never seen before, and while panic spread, laughter died, and fear took its place. Far in deep space the Varco's dominion celebrated their victory, drinking, boasting, mocking humans again, saying humans would kneel, humans would beg, humans would break. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that a fleet like a black storm was already on the way, silent, invisible, unstoppable, driven not by conquest but by grief, by fury, by justice, and in that unstoppable moment one truth became clear across every human heart. Humans were done kneeling, done staying quiet, done being harmless, and for the first time in 300 years the galaxy was about to learn what humanity really was. Not weak, not soft, not harmless, but something far more terrifying, something ancient, something unbroken, something the stars themselves feared. And as the silent fleet accelerated into the darkness, engines shaking space like thunder, one thought echoed through every ship, every pilot, every human soul like a vow carved in stone. For the first time in centuries, humans were angry, and the galaxy would never forget what happened next as the silent fleet vanished into the black ocean of space. Earth itself seemed to stop breathing, cities frozen in quiet streets, lights dim, people staring at the sky knowing something had changed forever. Because for centuries humans chose patience, chose peace, chose silence, but now, that silence felt like a wound, a sharp pain inside every heart, especially for the families of Haven for who had lost everything, parents with empty arms, children with no home, brothers staring at screens hoping for news that would never come. And across Earth millions watched the footage of the burned colony, the scorched ground, the twisted metal, and that terrible message humans kneel carved like a knife into their souls, and grief turned into something colder, heavier, like a storm, gathering in their chests, and in homes, shelters, bases, and hospitals people cried quietly, holding each other, whispering why them, why did no one help, why did the council ignore their screams, and every tear became fuel, a spark, a memory that humanity would carry into the darkness, because this was not just war, this was personal, this was family, this was blood, and while Earth mourned, deep inside Vault Zero, the Supreme Commander stood alone in front of a glowing holoscreen, replaying the last seconds of Haven 4, a mother screaming for her child, a child reaching for help, flames rising, signal fading, and he clenched his shaking hands behind his back, his voice breaking for the first time in decades as he whispered, "We failed them." And those words were not strategy, not command, but raw pain, because he had once lived on that colony, he had walked those streets as a young man, he had laughed in those markets, and now the memories were ashes, and his grief was a blade cutting deeper than any weapon, and as he closed his eyes he could still hear the last recorded voice from Haven 4, a little boy crying, begging, "Please don't leave us." And that innocent voice haunted every heartbeat in the bunker, Soldiers standing at attention but swallowing tears, knowing they were not marching for glory or medals. They were marching for children who never had a chance to grow up, and while Earth grieved. Far across the galaxy in the council hall, alien leaders argued. Loudly, pretending control, pretending calm, but fear vibrated under every word. Because their scanners had shown something impossible. Human warships using technology older and stronger than anything in council history. And some leaders whispered that humans might have been hiding their true strength all along. But others shrugged, saying humans were emotional creatures acting out of sadness, not power. But then a courier burst into the chamber, pale and shaking, holding a data pad with a single dark report. The silent fleet was gone from all scanners, vanished, invisible, and the council froze in fear. Because no fleet that size should be able to disappear. No engines that loud should leave no trace. And suddenly the laughter that once mocked humans turned into silence, heavy and terrified. But still the council chose denial, saying humans would calm down, saying grief made them unstable, saying they would kneel eventually. And that ignorance cut deeper than any insult. Because, while the galaxy dismissed human pain, billions of humans felt their own hearts break, and broken hearts do not bow, they rise, and in the darkest corridors of Vault Zero, young pilots prepared for launch in silence, some trembling, some whispering the names of lost friends, some holding tiny pictures of families from Haven 4, and one pilot, a girl barely 20, pressed her forehead to the cold metal of her fighter and whispered through tears, "I'm sorry I wasn't there," because her older brother had died in the attack, his last message a cheerful recording saying he'd saved money to visit home soon, and now she would fly into a war she never asked for, fueled not by rage alone but by the ache of love stolen too soon, and as she boarded her craft, tears still wet, she saw other pilots crying too, soldiers wiping eyes quickly so no one noticed, because this fleet wasn't built from arrogance, it was built from heartbreak, and heartbreak is the most dangerous fuel in the universe. And while the fleet pushed deeper into silent space, Earth civilians stood united for the first time in centuries, lighting candles, holding hands, sharing food, comforting strangers, whispering promises that Haven 4 would be avenged, and those tiny flames in windows across Earth looked fragile. But together they formed something stronger than steel, human unity, born from pain, shaped by loss. And somewhere out there the Varco's dominion celebrated without fear, drinking, laughing, calling. Humans, fragile creatures ruled by emotion, not knowing that emotion was the fire that forged humanity's strength, not knowing that every tear on Earth was turning into resolve, not knowing that grief was sharpening into fury, and the Supreme Commander, watching the stars ahead, felt his voice steady again, no longer breaking, no longer lost, as he whispered to himself, "They think our sorrow makes us weak, but sorrow is where our strength begins." And in that single breath humanity changed from a silent species into something unstoppable, because when humans love, they protect, and when what they love is taken, they do not kneel, they do not break, they rise, and the galaxy, still laughing in distant corners, did not yet know that the saddest night in human history was becoming the beginning of the most terrifying force the stars had ever seen. A force born not from hate, but from heart. And nothing in the universe is more powerful than a heart that refuses to stay silent. As the silent fleet raced deeper into the dark between stars, moving like a black tide with no signal, no broadcast, no warning, Earth itself was changing. Because grief does not stay quiet forever. It grows, it spreads, it becomes something heavier, and every human on every colony felt that weight pressing on their chest. A mix of sorrow and rage that made the air feel colder, and in the great memorial hall on Earth, thousands gathered around a massive screen showing the names of the dead from Haven 4, names rising one after another in a slow, endless list. Mothers clutching pictures, fathers standing stiff with red eyes, children holding hands tightly, afraid to let go because letting go felt like losing them again. And as those names scrolled higher and higher, the silence became unbearable, a silence that tasted like emptiness, and in the very front row sat a small girl with trembling hands, holding a tiny drawing, 2 stick figures, one tall, one short, labeled Daddy and Me. And beside her lay a burnt metal tag recovered from the debris of Haven 4, the only thing left of her father's uniform, and she stared at it with a blank expression like she was too young to understand death but old enough to feel the hole it left in her chest. And when a soldier knelt beside her and softly asked if she wanted to speak his name for the memorial, her tiny voice cracked as she whispered, He promised he'd come home. And that single sentence shattered something inside every heart in the hall. Because promises were supposed to be kept, families were supposed to be safe, peace was supposed to mean protection, not slaughter, and tears fell freely, louder now, raw and unstoppable. And that grief echoed through every broadcast, reaching every corner of human space, uniting billions in a single emotion so powerful it felt like gravity, pulling all of humanity into one shared pulse of pain. And while Earth wept, the Council continued their cold debates, arguing over trade routes and political image, brushing off Haven for as a localized dispute, refusing to hold the Varco's Dominion accountable, refusing to send aid, refusing to even say the word massacre, and their indifference was like salt dumped into an open wound. Because humans weren't asking for pity, they were asking for truth, for justice, for acknowledgement that their dead mattered. But the Council gave nothing, only silence, and that silence hurt more than the attack itself. And deep aboard the flagship of the Silent Fleet, the Supreme Commander listened to recordings of the Council's dismissive statements, each word tightening his jaw, each sentence deepening the lines on his face, and a quiet despair settled behind his stern eyes because he realized peace had never been peace. It had been a cage, a lie the galaxy told to keep humans small, harmless, unseen, and now the Council wasn't just ignoring human pain. They were erasing it, pretending humanity's loss was insignificant. And that realization spread through the fleet like wildfire, turning sorrow into something sharper, something dangerous, something that did not feel like anger alone but heartbreak hardened into resolve. And among the pilots, one young man named Jalen sat in the cockpit of his fighter in total darkness, replaying a video message from his fiancée who had lived on Haven 4, her smiling face frozen on the screen, her voice saying she couldn't wait for him to come home so they could build a life together. And he pressed his forehead to the screen, whispering through clenched teeth, "I should have been there." And tears slipped down his cheeks, silent and shaky, because guilt is a cruel thing, twisting love into pain. And he wasn't alone. All around him other pilots sat in stillness, their breath shaky, their eyes red, their hearts breaking quietly in metal rooms where no one could hear them scream inside. And while their ships hummed with power, the humans inside them felt more fragile than ever, because war wasn't just coming, it was already inside them, tearing them apart. And in the medical bay of the flagship, an elderly doctor treated a soldier who had collapsed from emotional shock, the soldier gasping, saying he could hear the screams of Haven, for even though he'd never been there, and the doctor, voice trembling, whispered, "We all hear them." Because grief had become a ghost haunting every human, and that ghost was pushing them towards something irreversible, and back on Earth. That little girl with the drawing stood slowly and walked toward the memorial wall, placing her picture against the cold metal, her hand shaking as she whispered, "If they hurt him, why won't anyone stop them?" And no one in the hall could answer, because the truth was too painful. The galaxy didn't care, and humans had trusted a galaxy that never saw them as equals, and that betrayal burned deeper than any weapon. And in that moment the Supreme Commander received a final encrypted report. Satellite confirmation that the Varco's Dominion wasn't preparing defenses, wasn't bracing for retaliation. They were celebrating, hosting parades, broadcasting messages calling humans pathetic and laughable, saying the massacre was only the beginning, saying humans would kneel or be erased, and that cruel arrogance snapped the last fragile thread holding humanity together. Because grief can break people, but it can also transform them. And now humanity's broken hearts were aligning into a single unstoppable truth. This was no longer about revenge, it was about dignity, about existence, about telling the universe that human lives mattered, that human blood was not cheap, and that no one, ever again, would carve the word kneel into their graves. And as the Silent Fleet prepared to drop out of warp near the border of Varco space, every human on every ship breathed in the same trembling breath, heavy with pain, heavy with love, heavy with loss, and for the first time since Haven 4 burned, their tears stopped. Not because they stopped hurting, but because the pain had crystallized into something solid, unshakable, something the galaxy should have feared from the beginning. The moment when the human heart stopped breaking and started hardening. The moment when humanity rose not out of hatred but out of love that refused to die, and that moment, silent and unseen in the darkness of space, was the true beginning of a storm the galaxy would never be able to outrun as the Silent Fleet dropped out of warp at the border of Varco space. The stars looked colder than ever, sharp like knives against the black, and every human soldier felt their heartbeat slow, heavy, tense, because this was the closest humanity had come to war in 300 years, and the air inside every ship felt thick, like grief and fear were clinging to the walls, and in the command bridge of the flagship, the Supreme Commander stood still, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the hologram of Varco's territory, a red glowing line marking the point of no return, and his chest tightened because he knew crossing that border meant changing history forever. There would be no going back, no more silence, no more hiding, no more pretending humans were harmless, and even though fury burned in his eyes, there was something deeper beneath it. Sadness, the kind that comes from knowing that peace had died with Havenfall, that the last chance for mercy had been buried with thousands of innocent lives. And his voice trembled not with fear but with sorrow when he whispered, "We never wanted this. Because humanity had built gardens, not empires, had raised children, not armies, had dreamed of harmony, not destruction. But dreams can only survive if someone protects them, and no one had protected Havenfall. No one had protected those families, no one had stood with humans, and that betrayal felt like a second massacre, a wound that bled inside every heart. And far below the command deck, in the narrow halls of the flagship, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, not speaking, not moving, just breathing slowly as memories played behind their eyes. The laughter of loved ones, the warmth of home, the last messages, the last smiles, and some clutched personal tokens, a bracelet, a letter, a burnt photograph, items that felt heavier than weapons because they carried pieces of the lives that were stolen. And one young medic wiped her eyes with shaking hands as she whispered a promise to her twin sister who died on Havenfall, "I won't let them do this to anyone else." Her voice cracking with pain so deep she could barely breathe, and beside her another soldier silently reached out and held her hand, no words needed, because grief had made them a single family, and families protect their own. And while the humans prepared in quiet agony, the Varco's dominion remained arrogant and blind, broadcasting cruel messages across their networks, mocking humans, calling them crying animals, bragging that they would wipe out more colonies soon, and those words reached the silent fleet, echoing through encrypted channels, and when the soldiers heard them, their pain sharpened into something fierce, something that felt like a blade forged in their hearts, because the Varcos weren't just killers, they were proud of it, laughing at the suffering of children, celebrating the deaths of families, and that cruelty twisted every human stomach, because hatred hurts. But cruelty breaks something deeper, and breaking something inside a human is the most dangerous thing anyone could ever do. And in that moment the Supreme Commander finally turned to his officers, his eyes wet but unblinking, his voice low and steady like a storm buried under calm water. "They think our grief makes us weak, but grief is why we stand." And he gave the first order humanity had spoken in centuries: advance, and slowly, silently, the massive black warships crossed the border into Varco's space, engines glowing like blue stars, moving with deadly grace, no music, no speeches, no celebration, just a quiet determination that felt heavier than thunder. And somewhere deep in the bowels of the flagship, Jalen, the pilot who had lost his fiancée, strapped into his fighter, his breathing uneven as he whispered, "I'm scared," admitting the truth he had held inside for days, and his voice cracked because fear is not weakness. Fear is love trying to hold on, and he closed his eyes, seeing her face again, her smile frozen in his memory, and the fear transformed into something steadier, not anger, not revenge, but a desperate need to make sure no one else lost what he lost, and he whispered shakily, "I'm doing this for you." And across the fleet other pilots murmured similar promises, to mothers, to brothers, to friends, to children, because this war was not about conquest, it was about love that had nowhere else to go, love that had been shattered and now burned like fire inside their bones. And on Earth, millions gathered in public squares, staring at giant screens showing the silent fleet's position as it moved deeper into enemy space, and the crowd trembled with a single emotion: fear that they might lose more lives, more families, more children, because even in their fury humans still cared, still loved, still wanted peace, and that ache made the moment even more painful, because they weren't cheering for war, they were praying against more loss, and among them stood the little girl from the memorial, the one with the drawing of her father, clutching the metal tag against her chest like a lifeline, her small voice trembling as she whispered, "Please come home." Even though she didn't know who she was speaking to, maybe the soldiers, maybe the whole fleet, maybe the universe itself, and an elderly woman beside her gently placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "They're fighting so no one else loses home." And tears ran down the girl's face again. Soft and silent, because children shouldn't have to understand war, they shouldn't have to carry grief, and yet here she was, one tiny symbol of the pain carried by billions, and her tears weren't just hers. They belonged to humanity, and as they fell, the silent fleet reached the first Varco's outpost, its turrets glowing red, scanning space lazily, guards laughing, unaware that death itself was drifting toward them, silent and cold, driven not by hatred but by heartbreak, and in that final breath before the first strike, every human on every ship exhaled the same silent thought, heavy with sorrow and fire. This is not who we wanted to become, but this is who we must be, because love, once broken, will fight to protect what remains, and the galaxy had no idea that humanity's gentleness, once shattered, had become the most terrifying force in existence. The silent fleet hovered before the first Varco's outpost like a black shadow swallowing the stars, engines humming low, weapons still silent, and inside every human heart there was a painful tremble, not excitement, not pride, but dread, because crossing into enemy space had already changed them, and now the next step would change them even more, and in the flagship bridge the Supreme Commander stared at the outpost on the screen, seeing enemy soldiers laughing, relaxed, unguarded, never imagining the grief they had caused, and his throat tightened because destroying them would not bring haven for back, it would not return the dead, it would not erase the cries of children, but doing nothing would let more pain happen, and that impossible choice crushed his chest, because humans never wanted to be monsters, never wanted to be killers, they just wanted to be safe, and safety had been stolen, and as the order to prepare weapons echoed softly through the fleet, the halls filled with a quiet rustle, soldiers standing, pilots sealing helmets, medics clutching trembling hands, and no one cheered, no one smiled, no one raised fists, because this wasn't revenge to them, it was survival, and survival hurts, and in the fighter bay Jalen sat alone in his cockpit, shaking, staring at the countdown timer glowing in red numbers, and he whispered to himself that he wasn't ready, that he was still broken, that he still woke up hearing his fiancée's voice, still saw her smiling in his mind before remembering she was gone, and his chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe, and for a moment he wanted to run, to hide, to curl into a corner like a wounded animal. Because love makes people strong but loss makes them fragile, and he felt both at the same time, like his heart was shattering and burning all at once, and his fingers hesitated above the ignition, tears filling his eyes, whispering, "I don't want to kill anyone." Because beneath all the pain he was still human, still kind, still soft inside, and kindness is the most painful thing to carry into war, and though no one could hear him, he wasn't alone. Because across the bay the young medic who lost her twin sister was wiping her tears too, whispering, "I wish they had chosen peace." And her voice cracked so deeply it sounded like it came from somewhere inside her soul. And all around them other soldiers trembled silently. Because war doesn't just take lives, it takes innocence, and innocence is the hardest thing to lose, and while the humans struggled with their breaking hearts, the Varco's outpost intercepted the silent fleet's presence and sent a mocking broadcast, laughter echoing through the speakers, calling humans prey, calling haven for a warm-up, promising to erase the rest. And those words stabbed every human like a blade, reopening wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. And in that moment the Supreme Commander lowered his head, a tear slipping down his cheek, because he understood something terrible. There was no kindness left to appeal to, no peace to negotiate, no mercy to hope for, and that realization felt like losing haven for all over again. Because they weren't fighting monsters with claws, they were fighting monsters with pride, monsters who laughed at death, who celebrated pain, who saw grief as weakness, and that cruelty hardened something inside the commander's chest, not into hate, but into resolve, a resolve born from love for his people. And with a voice so soft it sounded like a whisper over a grave, he gave the first battle command humanity had spoken in centuries, fire. And in an instant the silent fleet unleashed its weapons. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise, beams of blue light slicing through space, striking the outpost with surgical accuracy, and the Varco's soldiers never even had time to scream, the station erupting into silent flames, pieces scattering into the void like shattered bones, and inside the ship's humans watched the explosion not with triumph but with horror, because witnessing death, even the death of those who caused pain, twisted something deep inside them, and hearts that were already cracked now felt broken in a new way, because violence doesn't just hurt the victim, it hurts the one who delivers it. And in the fighter cockpit, Jalen stared at the burning debris with wide, trembling eyes, whispering through clenched teeth, "I didn't want this." His voice shaking as tears spilled down his face, because the death of his fiancée hadn't prepared him for the feeling of taking a life, and guilt surged inside him like poison, mixing with grief until he felt sick, and he covered his face with both hands, shaking, whispering, "What are we becoming?" And that question echoed through every ship, through every soldier, through every silent breath, because humans had crossed a line they could never uncross, not just in the universe, but inside themselves, and far away on Earth. The little girl with her father's metal tag watched the battle feed with wide, frightened eyes, seeing the explosion, seeing the fire, her small hand tightening around the tag as she whispered, "I don't want more people to die," because even a child understood the truth. War doesn't heal wounds, it makes new ones, and her tears fell again, soft and scared, because she didn't know if humanity was saving lives or losing themselves, and behind her, crowds stood in stunned silence, no cheers, no joy, just heavy sorrow, because everyone realized something the Varkos never understood. Humans did not win anything in that moment. They only lost another piece of their heart. And in the command bridge, the Supreme Commander whispered brokenly, "Forgive us." Though he didn't know who he was speaking to, the dead of Haven 4, the dead in the outpost, or the humanity inside them that was slowly being torn apart. And as the flames faded into cold ash and the fleet moved on, deeper into enemy space, every soul aboard carried a wound that would never fully heal, because grief had led them to war, and war had shown them the cruelest truth of all. When humans fight to protect what they love, they can save others. But they lose parts of themselves, and that loss, silent and unseen, was the beginning of a pain even greater than Haven 4, a pain that would haunt humanity long after the last shot was fired. The silent fleet drifted away from the burning remains of the outpost like a ghost leaving a graveyard. No cheers, no shouts, no triumph, only a crushing silence that pressed against every human chest like a weight they could not lift. Because even though they had struck back, even though they had destroyed the first piece of the enemy, nothing felt healed, nothing felt lighter. In fact, the pain felt heavier, darker, because killing did not erase grief. It only added a new kind of hurt, one that twisted inside their hearts like a cold blade. And in the fighter bay, Jalen sat frozen in his cockpit long after the battle ended, hands trembling, breath shaking, staring at the dark smear of debris floating in space. And he whispered in a voice so small it barely existed, "I thought it would help," because somewhere deep inside he had believed that striking back would bring peace, would ease the agony of losing his fiancée, would fill the hollow ache in his chest. But instead it made him feel emptier, like a part of his soul had been scraped away, leaving him raw and shaking, and he shut off his visor, tears dripping onto his gloves, whispering, "I'm still hurting. I'm still alone," because revenge had not brought her back, and knowing that broke him in a way the massacre never could. And across the bay, the young medic who lost her twin sister collapsed to her knees, gripping the edge of a metal crate as she sobbed silently, her mouth open but no sound coming out, because grief that deep steals voices, and she pressed her forehead to the cold steel, whispering through her tears, "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted her back," and her hands shook so violently she could barely stay upright, because she felt guilt crawling under her skin, guilt for surviving, guilt for breathing, guilt for being alive when her sister wasn't, and that guilt was poison, spreading through her veins until she thought she might break apart completely, and around her other soldiers stared into nothing, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped, because the victory had no joy, only the sickening awareness that they had taken lives, and taking a life, even the life of someone cruel, changes a person forever, and the weight of that change was suffocating them. And in the medical bay, a young technician curled up on a cot, shaking as he whispered, "Are we turning into them?" Because he feared that each battle was chipping away the kindness inside them, the gentleness, the humanity, leaving only anger and instinct, and that fear spread like wildfire through the ship, because deep down every soldier was terrified of becoming the very thing they were fighting. And on the flagship bridge, the Supreme Commander stood alone, staring at a blank screen, his reflection staring back at him with eyes that looked older, heavier, and he whispered to himself, "We crossed a line we can't cross back." His voice cracked and hollow, because he felt responsible for every death on both sides, the dead of Haven 4 and the dead of the outpost, and that responsibility crushed him like a mountain. Because leaders carry not just decisions, they carry ghosts, and the ghosts were gathering around him now, whispering what ifs, whispering failure, whispering blame, and he pressed his trembling hand against the console, whispering, I'm so sorry. Even though there was no one left to hear him, because apologies can't reach ashes, and ashes can't answer, and far away on Earth, billions watched the battle report, faces pale and silent, and for the first time since the massacre, fear replaced anger in their eyes, not fear of the enemy, but fear of themselves, fear of what humanity might become if this war continued, fear that in saving themselves they might lose the very thing that made them human, compassion, empathy, tenderness. And in a small quiet room in a relief shelter, the little girl with her father's metal tag sat alone, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red and puffy, and she whispered into the dim air, Daddy wouldn't want this. Her small voice trembling with a wisdom far too heavy for her age, because she understood something adults sometimes forget. Violence doesn't bring loved ones home. And she pressed the tag to her heart and whispered, Please stop, and that tiny plea, fragile and innocent, felt like a knife in the heart of anyone who heard it, because it reminded every human of the truth. This war had begun from love, but it was now feeding on pain, and pain was turning into something dangerous, something that could swallow them whole if they weren't careful. And in the darkness of his private quarters, the Supreme Commander sat on the floor, shoulders shaking, face buried in his hands, whispering, We're losing ourselves. Because he could feel it, the kindness draining, the sorrow turning to numbness, the empathy fading under the weight of survival, and that terrified him more than any weapon the Varkos could ever build, because losing humanity was worse than losing the war. And while the fleet drifted through the cold void, carrying wounded hearts and silent tears, the Varkos' dominion broadcast new threats, promising more massacres, more ashes, more suffering, laughing as they spoke, proud of their cruelty. And those words hit the silent fleet like a fresh wound, reopening every scar, twisting every broken heart into a tighter knot of grief and fear. And in that moment humanity stood at the edge of something terrible. Not just a galactic war, but an inner collapse, because their pain was beginning to turn numb, and numbness is the most dangerous thing a human can feel, because when a heart stops hurting, it stops caring, and when it stops caring, anything becomes possible, even the unthinkable. And as the silent fleet pushed deeper toward the Varkos' capital, every human soul carried a fragile truth like a flickering candle in a storm. They were fighting to protect life, but they were burning themselves in the process, and if that flame went out, if they lost the last pieces of tenderness inside them, the galaxy would not just fear humanity. It would lose them forever, and humanity, for the first time, feared that too. The silent fleet moved deeper into Varkos' territory, its black hulls gliding through the void like wounded giants, and every kilometer felt heavier than the last, because the deeper they went, the further away they moved from who they used to be, and the humans aboard could feel it, like something inside them was slowly cracking, a quiet fracture running through every heart. And in the dim corridors of the flagship, the air felt colder, quieter, like the ships themselves were grieving, their metal walls soaked with the silent weight of everything humanity had lost. And in the fighter bay Jalen sat alone, suit unzipped, hands shaking violently as he stared at the photo of his fiancée on his wrist screen. Her smile so bright, so alive, and he whispered, voice breaking, You wouldn't recognize me now. Because the gentle boy she loved, the one who wrote her letters and dreamed about building a home with her, was disappearing inside him, replaced by someone hollow, someone numb, someone who didn't know how to feel anymore. And that numbness terrified him more than death, because at least pain meant he still cared, but numbness meant he was fading, losing the very soul she once held in her hands. And he pressed his forehead to the cold glass, a tear sliding down as he whispered, I don't want to forget how to love. And that one sentence held the truth of every soldier in the fleet. They weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of becoming something unrecognizable, something empty, something without heart. Across the ship the young medic who lost her twin sister sat in the dark of the infirmary, an untouched medical kit on her lap, her shoulders trembling as she whispered her sister's name over and over like a prayer she was terrified the universe would forget. Because saying the name made her feel like her sister was still alive somehow, still close, still here. But every time she reached the end of the whisper her voice cracked and her chest caved in as she remembered the cold, brutal truth. Her sister was gone, burned in the attack, erased from the world, and she would never hear her laugh again, never share secrets again, never feel that familiar hand in hers, and the ache was so deep it felt like her ribs might break, and she curled forward, clutching her chest like she was trying to hold her own heart together with shaking fingers, whispering, "If we keep fighting like this, will there be anything left of me?" And she didn't know if she meant her life or her soul, because both felt like they were slipping away. On the bridge, the Supreme Commander stared at the glowing map of Varco's space, the path ahead leading straight to the capital, straight to the heart of the empire that had laughed at human pain, straight to the place where this nightmare began. And his reflection in the glass didn't look like a leader anymore. It looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 days, his eyes hollow, his shoulders heavy. His hands trembling so faintly he kept them hidden behind his back so no one would see, and he whispered, voice hoarse, "How much more can we endure?" Because he wasn't just asking about the war, he was asking about the human spirit, the fragile thread that held them together, the last flicker of empathy inside them, and he feared that one more blow, one more loss, one more scream might snap that thread forever, and then what would humanity be? Strong, maybe. Fearless, maybe. But empty. And emptiness was worse than death. Then the fleet received a transmission, an intercepted Varco's broadcast, not aimed at them, not meant for human ears, but dripping with cruelty, a recording of Varco's soldiers cheering as they discussed plans for another human colony, one not yet attacked, one still full of families, children, laughter, life, and they called it the next bonfire. Laughing as if human lives were fuel, as if suffering was entertainment, as if grief was nothing more than a joke, and the broadcast described the colony's name, its location, its population, 4,000 to 7,000 civilians, including 9,000 children, and when those numbers hit the fleet, the silence shattered like glass, because the pain they carried wasn't just memory anymore, it was prophecy, a warning that more families would be torn apart, more children would become orphans, more names would scroll across memorial screens, and that realization wasn't like fire, it was like ice, cold and merciless, freezing every breath, every heartbeat, every tear. On Earth, when the news reached the public, entire crowds fell to their knees, some sobbing, some screaming, some whispering the same desperate question, "Not again, please not again," because Haven 4 hadn't even begun to heal, and the wound was about to be torn open all over again, and in a quiet shelter room the little girl with her father's metal tag curled into a blanket, trembling as she whispered, "Why do they want to hurt us?" Her small voice breaking under a grief no child should ever carry, and the woman beside her pulled her close, tears falling silently as she whispered, "Because they don't know love," and the child nodded slowly, eyes wet and wide, and whispered, "Then we can't lose ours." And those tiny words, spoken by a heart that had already lost so much, were like a mirror held to humanity's soul, reflecting the truth they were terrified to face. If they let their pain turn into hatred, if they let numbness replace compassion, if they let war kill what was left of their tenderness, then the Varcos wouldn't need to destroy humanity. Humanity would destroy itself. Back on the flagship, the Supreme Commander closed his eyes, and for the first time since the war began, he felt something break inside him, not out of weakness, but out of unbearable love for the people he swore to protect. And a tear slid down his cheek as he whispered, "We are standing on the edge." Because he knew the next decision he made would decide not just the fate of a colony, not just the fate of the war, but the fate of the human soul itself. And as the silent fleet turned toward that doomed colony, every soldier, every pilot, every heart whispered the same desperate, trembling truth. This wasn't about victory anymore. This was about saving the last pieces of who they were. Because if they failed, if the colony burned, if more children cried, then something inside humanity would shatter forever. And in that silent, trembling moment, the galaxy didn't just face the power of humanity. It faced the possibility of losing them, not from death, but from heartbreak so deep it could steal everything gentle, kind, and human from their souls, leaving only shadows behind. The silent fleet accelerated toward the threatened colony, engines burning like blue stars against the black void, and every second felt like a countdown to heartbreak, because the intercepted broadcast wasn't just words. It was a promise of another Haven 4, another world turned into ashes, another 4,000 to 7,000 souls erased from existence, and that number echoed through every ship like a scream. No one could silence, and in the command bridge the Supreme Commander stood frozen, eyes locked on the hologram of the colony. Small, peaceful, unarmed, unaware. A place that looked almost gentle, with green valleys and tiny towns, a world full of laughter. Gardens, schools, families, and his chest tightened painfully because it reminded him of the home he once had before war, before loss, before this nightmare, and he whispered, voice trembling, "We cannot fail them." But beneath those words was something deeper, more fragile, a fear that if humanity watched another colony burn, something inside them would die forever, the last fragile thread of compassion snapping beyond repair. In the fighter bay, Jalen stared at the mission briefing, reading the population numbers again and again, and his throat closed as he whispered, 9,000 children. Because that number hit him harder than any weapon, harder than any battle, harder than the grief of losing his fiancée, because he remembered her voice, soft and hopeful, talking about wanting kids someday, dreaming of a family, a quiet life, a future filled with tiny footsteps and laughter, and now the thought of 9,000 children screaming, 9,000 futures stolen, 9,000 hopes burned to nothing. It felt like his heart was being crushed in a fist he couldn't escape, and tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save them." His voice breaking as he fastened his harness with trembling hands, because for the first time since the war began, he wasn't flying to destroy, he was flying to protect. In the medical bay, the young medic who lost her twin sister stared at a projection of the colony's surface. Small houses nestled near lakes, playgrounds, markets, faces full of ordinary joy, and she felt something shift inside her, not anger, not numbness, but a sudden surge of fierce, trembling love for people she had never met, and she whispered, "They deserve to live," her voice trembling like a candle flame in the wind, and she pressed her palm against the cold screen, imagining her sister, smiling somewhere like that, alive, safe, laughing, and her breath hitched as she whispered, "I won't let another sister lose her twin." Because grief had shattered her, but this mission forced her to remember the part of her heart that still cared, still loved, still believed in protecting life, and that tiny flicker of emotion was enough to drag her back from the numbness that had been swallowing her whole. Far away on Earth, when word spread that a second colony was in danger, crowds flooded the streets, not with rage this time, but with fear, raw, trembling fear that history was repeating, that humanity would watch another world die, and in a crowded shelter room the little girl with her father's tag clutched it close to her heart and whispered, "Please save them." Her voice so small yet so powerful, because the entire planet felt that same desperate plea, that same fragile hope, that same need. To protect someone, anyone, before the universe tore another piece from them, and that child's whispered prayer became a silent anthem across Earth, a reminder that even in war, even in heartbreak, humanity was still capable of love. Back in the flagship, alarms suddenly flared. Varco's warships detected ahead, a strike force already moving toward the colony, 6 battle cruisers, 3 destroyers, and a carrier full of soldiers ready to rain death upon innocent lives. And the sight of that fleet hit every human like a punch to the gut. Because it wasn't a threat anymore, it was real, it was happening, destruction was on its way, and humanity was the only shield standing between life and annihilation. The Supreme Commander closed his eyes for one agonizing heartbeat, and in that heartbeat he saw the faces of Haven 4, the flames, the bodies, the silence, and he heard again the last terrified cry of the little boy from the recording, "Please don't leave us." And that memory tore through him like lightning, ripping open every wound he had buried, and when he opened his eyes again, they were wet but fierce, burning not with hatred, but with something far stronger, devotion, a vow carved into his soul, and with a voice that shook the bridge like thunder, he gave the order that would define humanity's future. All ships, defend the colony, no matter the cost. The silent fleet surged forward, not as avengers, not as executioners, but as guardians, their engines roaring through the void like a heartbeat returning to life, and every human aboard felt something ignite inside them. Not fury, but purpose, a purpose rooted in the one thing they had thought they might lose forever. Love. In the cockpit of his fighter, Jalen whispered, "This time, we save them." Wiping one last tear as his hands steadied on the controls, because protecting life felt like the first breath he had taken in days, and in the infirmary the medic stood tall for the first time since her sister died, whispering, "This is who we are," as she prepared for casualties not with dread, but with determination. Because saving others was the closest she could come to honoring her sister's memory. And as the Silent Fleet's weapons powered up, not to destroy a world, but to protect one, the galaxy witnessed something it had never seen before. Humanity choosing love over vengeance, protection over destruction, mercy over madness, and in that single, fragile moment, on the edge of war, humanity pulled itself back from the darkness, not because they were unbreakable, but because even broken hearts can still fight for what's right. And sometimes the deepest pain becomes the strongest shield. The Varco's ships closed in like wolves, snarling and ready to slaughter, but humanity did not flinch, did not kneel, did not tremble, because this battle was not born from anger. It was born from love, and nothing in the universe is more terrifying, more powerful, or more unstoppable than a broken heart that remembers its humanity.